Hello, sophomores. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 12, Section 2, The War in the Pacific. So let's get started here. Early phases of the war, shortly after the attack at Pearl Harbor, basically went badly for the United States. Within hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had attacked American airfields in the Philippines. And within a matter of a few months, things got worse when the Japanese took over the Philippines. So, commander of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific was Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur. As you can see, these two men photographed below. MacArthur with the pipe in his mouth, kind of looks like a corn cob. Anyway, he was the commander of U.S. troops in the Philippines. He was ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the islands in March of 1942 as the Japanese had invaded and were quickly overpowering U.S. forces. And he's kind of known for saying, "I shall return." But he left, but his men stayed. And unfortunately for the men, many of them were imprisoned by the Japanese and treated horribly. There is an event known as the Bataan Death March, where about 78,000 U.S. POWs, prisoners of war, were marched by the Japanese to camps, prison camps in the Philippines. Along the way, about 10,000 men died. Some of these men were held for the duration of the war, and in some cases had lost lots and lots of weight, to the point where they probably were looking very emaciated, to the point where probably less than 100 pounds for some of these able-bodied men. Also in April of 1942, the United States is going to try to strike back, kind of like the Empire Strikes Back. We had an event known as the Doolittle Raid, named after Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who you see kind of pictured kind of in the middle of your screen there with the flag behind his back. Doolittle was with the Army Air Corps, and he was in charge of designing a bombing campaign to strike Tokyo. And the goal was that U.S. naval carriers, would take Army aircraft, which is kind of a weird thing because usually the Army and the Navy don't like to work together. But these pilots practiced basically down in Florida for a time. They had to be able to launch their aircraft kind of on a short runway. A lot of times when planes are being launched off of a carrier, they have a catapult that kind of pushes the plane. And so you kind of had some of that. But typically, a lot of those aircraft are a lot smaller and maybe not as heavy as some of these bombers. So there was a lot of concerns about whether or not the conditions at sea, whether or not some of these planes would even make it off the deck. But they basically, on the day that they started this campaign in April, they were out at sea, and supposedly a Japanese fishing boat spotted the carrier. And so rather than returning back to base, the military makes the decision to launch. They are not in the position that they thought they would be in. They're actually far from, kind of the rally point that they would have launched from. And the aircraft flew over Tokyo. And for the most part, they tried to go in and drop planes on Tokyo, and they were able to do that. Unfortunately, some of these planes were supposed to rendezvous in mainland China, and some of the planes ran out of fuel before they could even get to the mainland. And so planes had to be aborted. Some of the crews had to parachute. There were some crews that did make it to China, but in the course of trying to find a place to land, they ended up aborting their flights and parachuting and crashing the planes. The goal was that the aircraft would have gone to the Chinese military to fight the Japanese. And any Chinese civilian who had helped some of these crews, these pilots and some of the airmen, many of them were rounded up and executed by the Japanese. So it was a horrible situation, but we did drop bombs on Tokyo. And in a way, it was like a moral victory to say that we could actually reach mainland Japan and that the Japanese needed to take note of that, that the United States is coming. So when we talk about different battles that were happening kind of in the spring of 1942, you got to talk about the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. Battle of Coral Sea happened in May of 1942 and just kind of off the coast of Australia. If you take a look at the map on the left-hand side, you can see New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, and down in the corner there, Australia. Kind of not very far from where you would see like the Great Barrier Reef for the most part. But in this battle, the United States was able to sink a number of Japanese ships. Granted, we had some ships that sunk too, but it was kind of considered a victory because of the fact that some of the ships that we were able to sink were carriers that were used for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So dropping bombs and sinking those ships was kind of a, there you go. It's kind of like karma. We kind of got our revenge. When we talk about the Battle of Midway, we had, again, and I should have mentioned this before, we had intercepted Japanese communications, and we kind of knew about where they would be in the Coral Sea, but more importantly, we knew that they were going to rendezvous near Midway, which is kind of an atoll that's technically kind of part of the Hawaiian Islands. We knew that they were going to be there, and so we show up. And for the most part, this is not necessarily a battleship kind of battle. It's actually a battle of carriers with aircraft doing the vast majority of the bombing. And we sunk some ships at Midway and prevented the Japanese from striking at Hawaii again. So 2 victories in a very short haul, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the war is going to wrap up fast in the Pacific. So despite all their losses at the Coral Sea, American forces prevented the Japanese from cutting the U.S. supply lines in the Pacific to Australia. So that's a victory. Unaware that they were heading into an ambush, the Japanese advance in the Pacific was stopped on June 4th, 1942, at the Battle of Midway. And you can kind of see some photos there from that event. This marked a turning point in the war in the Pacific. From henceforth on, Japan is not going to be so much as running offense as they are going to be on the defensive to kind of protect their holdings. Okay, we're going to be the ones making the advancements, playing offense here. So, the Navajo Code Talkers. This were a group of Native Americans, particularly from the Navajo Nation down in parts of New Mexico and Arizona, who used their native language to aid the U.S. Marine Corps as far as being able to transmit coded military messages in their own language. Truth be it, there were lots and lots of American Indian code talkers. If you start reading a little bit of the history, there were Lakota Sioux, there were Omaha Nation. If you can imagine a Native American tribe that has a language, they were probably being recruited in to train to do these kind of codes for the military. But the Navajo code talkers are unique because their code never got broke. And thus, this is the one code that the Japanese couldn't figure out. And part of it's being the language. The language is really kind of complex, and that kind of worked to our benefit. So, geographic problems with the Central Pacific was that many of the islands were coral reefs, atolls, and as a result of that, you don't really have a lot of like water resources. You've got the possibility of some of that being volcanic. But there were a few of these atolls that were actually ideal for putting in landing strips for the Navy and the Army Air Corps. And thus they became kind of the things that we wanted strategically to have possession of. So Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, they drove the Japanese off the islands and slowly were able to capture the Pacific. A lot of what they were doing was to try to make sure that they weren't going after every island, and thus we had a campaign of island hopping, which was this idea of skipping non-essential islands and only hitting the ones that were really important. The idea was that the Japanese had actually put a lot of troops on various islands. Those troops would be cut off from any supplies, and with the hope that they would surrender if they would be eventually occupied. Story goes is that there was a guy found in the 1960s who was Japanese that hadn't been told that the war had ended and was still fighting World War II at the time of the Cold War. So yeah, it's kind of weird things that happened then. But using island hopping got us closer to the mainland, and that was really the key here. We wanted to get closer to Japan and do it as quickly as possible. So American military planners, they wanted to use the Mariana Islands, which is, if you look at the map down below, it's kind of in the center of your screen. It's not very far from Guam, not very far from the Marshall Islands. We wanted to use that for a new heavy bomber base. And one of these islands that is, kind of important within this area, you got Tinian. And Tinian is going to be the island that we're going to launch the Enola Gay and the Boxcar, which are going to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So General Douglas MacArthur has advanced through the Solomon Islands. He was able to destroy a Japanese base in New Guinea and recapture the Philippines. This strategy surprised the Japanese. The U.S. was able to destroy the Japanese fleet, and successfully recapture the Pacific Islands. So, to make this happen, we started using some interesting tools here. We got Amtraks, which were kind of like an amphibious tractor. You also had what they would call is, like, sometimes if you go up to the Wisconsin Dells, or if you go down to Branson, they have what they call the ducks, which are a vehicle that is on land, kind of like a truck, but it's capable of driving into the water and becoming a boat. These vehicles were used in the Pacific. They're kind of fun to travel on if you happen to be on vacation, because some of them were saved after the war. But it made it possible to get to places that we hadn't been able to get to before. The Battle of the Leyte Gulf, this is the battle for the Philippines for the most part. It was the largest naval battle in our history, period. It was the first time that the Japanese started using kamikaze attacks. Now, this whole idea of like taking a pilot and making a suicide bomber, this is really nothing new. As a matter of fact, a lot of pilots, particularly naval pilots, if they knew that their plane was going to crash, a lot of times they would try to find a target where they could crash the plane into if they thought that they probably were going to die regardless. But with the kamikazes, it was a little different. A lot of these pilots were very young, many of them probably in their teens. They had very little training. They were kind of taught how to start a plane and to take off, and not really a lot about how to land. They were kind of brainwashed into the belief that by performing the act of a kamikaze, the divine wind, that they would be, honoring their emperor, and thus they would have privilege after they die. Okay, the gods in the Japanese Shinto religion would look kindly upon their families. Unfortunately, they're suicide bombers, so they're not really going to reap any reward for what they're doing. Japanese naval forces ambushed the U.S. fleet before retreating. With the use of kamikazes, the ship that you see down in the bottom left-hand corner, with the airplane that's kind of getting close to it, that is a very famous ship. That is the USS Missouri. That is the ship that at the very end of the war that the Japanese are going to surrender on, okay, ending the war. But this aircraft is actually going to hit the side of the ship. And what's interesting is it does just a little bit of damage. It doesn't really sink the ship. It doesn't really destroy the ship. For the most part, it put a dent, kind of like if you were in a fender bender in the parking lot. So, our material that we were using for our battleships and for our military, it was pretty heavy duty if you could just get a ding out of it. So, thank you very much.